So I'm Emma Green. I'm a fifth year PhD student in the developmental area here at UW. My research primarily focuses around child shyness and child social anxiety, and specifically how their social dispositions or their social personalities really affects the way that they view the world. So I do a lot on theory of mind or peer relationships between children. And yeah, that's about a good summary of it at this point.
Cool. Yeah, I'm Brady. I'm in the PhD program in the cognitive neuroscience area. My current research, or I guess all the research I've ever done really, is looking at ways to essentially improve memory, episodic memory. And I mainly look at ways to improve memory using motoric or visuospatial encoding tasks. So drawing or enacting, things like that. And more recently, my focus has been on the mnemonic properties of symbols. So things like the $ and stuff on your keyboard. We're looking at how those are kind of represented in the brain, and if they are encoded as pictures or as words or as something kind of in between.
So as we can see, we have graduate students that are extremely talented and have a wide range of interests from different fields in psychology. So our second question is, how did you decide on your research topic? And did you have any help from your supervisor in this process? So a lot of questions that we got in the survey were students asking, do you enter your graduate program with a topic already decided in your mind? And also if it's okay to change topics along the way.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I started graduate school having an interest in self-compassion because my honors thesis was in the domain of self-compassion and coping. And so I had some experience with that, and I knew I really liked it. I knew I wanted to continue. So I was looking actively for somebody who studied self-compassion, but I was really broad. I wasn't really sure what that was. So I actually took a year off between grad school and my honors thesis just to kind of see what I like and do some work with different labs. But so when I came into grad school, I knew I wanted something with self-compassion. Ironically, in my interview with my supervisor, Dr. Kelly, I was like, I want nothing to do with eating disorders. And then once I started learning about it, I'm like, oh, that's all I want to study is eating disorders. And so, yeah, so there's obviously some flexibility there. My supervisor was super helpful in helping me decide a topic and learning that together. There is, at least in the clinical program, like people do switch topics throughout their graduate degree. I would say it is in the same like domain of things that they're interested in. And so it would be very unlikely for someone in my lab that mostly studies eating disorders and self-compassion to start studying like child communication. Like that just would probably not happen, and our supervisor doesn't have the expertise to supervise that. But there is some movement in our lab about what people study under like the umbrella that is like self-compassion and eating and body image. Emma, you're muted.
We're good. I got this. Oof, it's been like, what, 7 months and I still can't figure out the mute function. So this is actually a really good question because when I first arrived at grad school, my very first day, I always joke that I met with my supervisor, Dr. Heather Henderson, and I went into my meeting and I was like, oh my God, she's so amazing. She's so smart. I can't wait to work with her. And then I immediately went home and cried because I assumed I would never have any research ideas that would live up to her standard, because I was just like, I can't think of anything. I'm totally blank in this moment. Luckily, Heather was really great that she was like, okay, so I know that you're kind of interested in this. Why don't you see what's out there in terms of literature? And she gave me a starting point. Our lab is really unique in that we focus around sort of the idea of temperament, which is early personality in kids. And so that gives us a lot of leeway of like what we want to do. So I've done theory of mind, I've done dyadic, I've done EEG, I've done heart rate monitoring, I've done some parent work. I'm currently moving on to an online study. And so with our lab, because we're very flexible, I've been able to basically stay on the same track, because the big thing about completing a PhD is at the end of those 5 years, you need to do a defense where you basically say, I did this much research and it all kind of connects together, and this is why you should give me my doctorate. And so I don't really know how many students do like a really big flip right in the middle, because you want to be able to say, study 1 did this, study 2 did this, and study 3 did this?
Yeah, I guess I had a similar experience where it seems like, or I guess the first question is like, how did I come up with my research topic? My research topic kind of came up organically from the results of a study that we ran when I was like an RA in the same lab. So it's just, we kind of found like cool results and then we just pursued it. But I said before, my main line of research is on like these symbols and how they're encoded and stuff now, but it's really, at least in our lab or in like the cognitive and cognitive neuroscience areas, seems to be more like things that are kind of cool and interesting. Some of them work out and get published, some of them don't. And then the ones that work out the best, you kind of just pick as your PhD. Like a lot of PhD topics can be picked almost afterwards. Like I've heard of people doing all different kinds of lines of research, and then they just pick one that they've already written and published 3 papers on, convert those papers into a dissertation, and submit that. So it's actually, in some areas at least, I can't speak for the other areas, but in cognition and cognitive neuroscience, it seems to be really less about what your specific PhD line is and more just like a general interest area. So you definitely don't need to know your PhD topic going in, but you need to have a general sense of your interest area so you can pick the right supervisor. So I knew I was interested in memory, more specifically episodic memory. And at Waterloo, there was just like the 2 people who kind of do that, which is Myra Fernandez in CNS and Colin McLeod in cognition. So I'm actually co-supervised by both of them. So you just pick who fits best. And some supervisors will be a lot more accommodating than others for that. Some will be very strict and will want you to do a line of research that they've thought of. And some will just say, hey, as long as it's like, I can help you in that sense, like it's in my domain, then go ahead and go do it. So it really depends on the supervisor, I think, which is something you can kind of suss out when you go to interview for a school or when you are just kind of thinking about who you want to work with.
I just want to jump in and add something saying that, yeah, and I think like from all of our experiences, like you do not have to start grad school knowing what you want. And out of undergrad, it is so hard to know what you want and you learn so many things. And so actually like when I finished like undergrad, like I like had 2 things that because I thought I wanted neuroscience, and then I was like, oh, like I kind of like self-compassion, but I also kind of like forensics, and they are very different. And so it's like from all of our experiences, we got experience doing different kinds of things firsthand and seeing what you like. So I got some research experience working with like sexually motivated serial killers, and other research experience working with like self-compassion, and that really helped. But again, yeah, it's totally normal not to know what you want after undergrad.
That really clears things up because, yeah, I think myself included and like a lot of other undergrad students feel like we need to know right away, not only just for grad school, but also for our honors thesis, what specifically to do. And I'm glad that you touched on your research experience while answering this question, because our next question is about research experience. So from our professors, we're told that it's like really important to acquire this in undergrad, for grad school specifically. So I was wondering if you could talk about your undergraduate research experience, and was this like primary research or secondary research?
Like primary research as in like we collected our own data. Okay. Yeah. So every department's a little bit different, I think, like in terms of the emphasis placed on research. So, and every school, like with regards to clinical, at least, like so some schools for clinical like are very research heavy. Waterloo is one of those schools where research is prioritized, whereas some schools for clinical like don't care about research. So I can't speak on behalf of like the importance for all schools. But for myself, I did an undergraduate. So I went to the University of Guelph, and so I did like a research internship where you got to like work in a lab and write a research proposal. And then I did a full honors thesis in my undergraduate degree. And during that time, I didn't really volunteer in other labs. I really wasn't sure if I wanted like neuroscience or if I wanted to go into clinical. My bachelor's was actually neuroscience, so I really wasn't sure. And then I took a year off between grad school and like applying to graduate school and my undergrad just to further suss out my research interest. And so in that time, I worked at the University of Guelph, my honors thesis supervisor, to run my own research, which is a very rare opportunity. I don't know that you're going to find that these days, but I was able to run 2 of my own studies and also help with a couple studies that we're running at her lab as an RA and a research lab coordinator. And then I also collaborated with the University of Toronto, just being an RA on a couple of research projects to explore that forensic interest I had, because I really wasn't sure like if I wanted to be working with like criminals or like college students. It's a very big difference. And so I got to do some work there and experience firsthand like what I liked and didn't like. And so in my undergrad work, it was all primary research where I collected my own data and had experience doing that. When I worked with U of T, it was secondary research. I didn't get to firsthand collect interviews, but I had been given interviews to like transcribe and code and work with that, which both all of those I think like helped inform it. But as you can imagine, like the research experience itself like was something relate to what I do now, but the forensic research just gave me transferable skills. So yeah.
Yeah, so I came from an undergrad institution, so at U of T Scarborough campus, where it was really, really hard to get lab experience unless you took it as part of a course or you took it as your own course. Luckily, I was also part of the co-op program at that school, so I was able to gain research experience that way, and I really had to go out and find it on my own. So for one of my work terms, I was basically an RA, and I helped collect data for the, I'm sorry, my cat is very desperate to prove that she is here and that she wants to come greet you all. But so my first co-op experience was working with St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, and I worked in the trauma surgery unit there. And so they were doing a lot of research on whether or not ankle replacements work. Spoiler alert, please just get an ankle fusion. Those replacements are trash. You keep getting more surgeries and they're really, really gross. That one, basically, I learned how to be an RA. I learned how to interact with participants. I learned how to collect data. I learned how to pass out in an operating room when they were like, do you want to come watch a replacement surgery as your last day bonus? And I was like, please don't make me do this. And then I passed out and hit the floor. I also, for another co-op thing, I worked at the Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder at Sunnybrook Hospital. And for that, my main job was to write a paper that summer. So they had already collected data and they said, okay, we have all this unanalyzed data, write a paper about it. And so that was a really lucky break. That doesn't always happen. And then outside, I volunteered at Ontario Shores Centre for Mental Health Sciences in Whitby. And there I did volunteer work of working with a clinical population on the adolescent inpatient unit. And then I worked with their research division where I assisted with like patient research and geriatrics research. And then for my honors thesis, I actually did maternal infant research, looking at like a Stroop task. So none of my research background was actually like a perfect match to what I'm doing now, but I was able to kind of figure out that I was like, okay, I really like this sort of personality thing. I like this mental health thing. I don't like working with infants because they make me nervous, but I don't want to work with adults or geriatrics. So I looked for research that I'd be able to work in this sort of middle childhood adolescence work.
Yeah, what type of research experience did I accumulate? So I guess it was both. So I did a lot of secondary research experience by being an RA. I guess that's what we're calling secondary research experience. So I actually did my undergraduate here at Waterloo. And from what I've heard from other schools, especially like U of T, is it's very hard to find RA experiences. So didn't really have that issue here. There were lots of opportunities. And you may not know it if you're an undergrad, but our SONA pool here and the way our undergrad testing works here is actually one of the best in the country in terms of the access to participants, the number of participants, the fact that they're across all, 4 or 5 years of undergrad versus like, I think U of T's is only Psych 101, but I might be wrong about that. So
you're right.
We actually have thank you. So we actually have like a pretty cool system here for conducting research, and we have one of the highest outputs of research for that reason. So there's a lot of opportunities here at Waterloo for being an RA. And so I was an RA in only one lab in undergrad, which in retrospect was kind of dumb, but I put all my eggs in one basket and I just accumulated like 300 to 400 hours, logged hours of like RAing in that one lab. And then I got primary experience by doing an honors thesis, which, because I had done so much RAing, my honors thesis was a bit of a breeze because I was able to, like, I knew how to run participants, how to program studies, basic data analysis, things like that, how to behave, how to use Sona. So they kind of intertwine, but I guess in terms of hours, most of it was secondary RA experience.
Thank you for your responses. That's extremely helpful in helping us know like what kind of research experience we should be gathering as undergrads. So the next question is about sort of the timeline of the grad school application process. So students were wondering how long before the deadline should you start preparing all your documents, like reference letters, statement of purpose, and even writing the GRE.
Yeah, I feel like I'm a procrastinator, and so I'm gonna give you a mix of like what my experience was and then what I recommend to people, because I do think that's a helpful dichotomy. And as you will learn, is like, I'm sure in some of these grad school memes, like grad school did not help my procrastination abilities and just taught me this is the way of life sometimes. And so, okay, so applying to grad school, okay, writing the GRE is for clinical. This year doesn't count, and I can't speak to the importance of future years because I don't know what's happening with the GRE and if that's going to be needed. If the GRE is needed, I would say really like plan your time accordingly. I wrote it 2 times just to up my score because I know clinical is super competitive. And so the first time I wrote the GRE was in the beginning of my 4th year of undergrad. I had thought that I wanted to go to clinical right after my 4th year. And so I wrote it in about September. Halfway through the GRE, I decided, screw this, I'm not going to grad school next year. And then I waited and studied for about like 5 months and rewrote it again later in the year. Applying for grad school, the application, I would say, like, I recommend, and I started thinking about it in September. And so I would say, like, starting in September and doing it early, giving your references lots of notice, depending on how many schools you're applying to, especially for clinical, like it could be fairly intensive reference letters. And so I would say I asked my references like within the first 2 weeks of September, and I offered like everything that they could need. Like I asked, like, what can I give you to support you in being a reference? So it helped them to have a couple months, especially like in case they had questions come up. And for graduate school, you also like are encouraged to apply for funding, which is like external scholarships in your first year or like before you come here. So I would just say starting everything in September to get yourself lots of time for like December deadlines is really helpful from my experience. Inevitably, like there is a lot of busyness that happens with like courses if you're working and all of that. So I would say plan accordingly, but give yourself at least a couple months from my experience.
Yeah, so I can echo Elisa's comment on that grad school students, and maybe Brady's going to prove us wrong, that we are A+ procrastinators and that we do not do things unless we are put under the gun. So I started thinking about the idea of grad school the summer before I applied. And then I realized in September that I actually should start doing stuff. So I actually wrote my GREs 3 times in 3 months. I do not recommend it. I also wrote the psych GRE during that time. I was basically a mess. It was great. I tried to at least contact most of my referees by October-ish and just say like, look, I'm applying here, 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 and here, because I did apply to quite a few programs. And then as I got close to the deadline, because I was waiting to, build my statements, build my CVs, figure everything out, I would update them saying like, okay, here it is. Obviously, things like I would recommend, I definitely think like start in September, or honestly, you can't really start too early because most departments will start putting things on their websites that say like, this supervisor is looking for students next year, and this supervisor will be accepting students next year. And those usually start going out over the summer. And so you can honestly just start doing like those cold call, which are the worst thing in the world. I fully sympathize that I hate doing them. I'm doing them again as applying to postdocs. Is to start sending out those cold calls like, hey, I'll be applying to grad school this year. I really find your research interesting. If you have any opportunity, I'd love to talk to you, or just keep an eye out for my reference or for my application. I will say probably about 90% of them will send you back an email that goes, I'm not talking to students until the department vets them. And you're like, all right, fine. But you get a couple that will be like, oh, okay, well, why don't you send me your CV or just tell me a little bit about yourself? And maybe nothing comes out of it. Maybe something comes out of it. It's a benefit. For the GRE, again, it's not running at most schools this year. I do not recommend pulling what I did. Start thinking about it early, do it the summer before if you can, because then you could just spend the fall semester focusing on probably your courses or your honors thesis or your writing your statements. That way you don't have to. So I actually lived in Whitby for my undergrad, and the closest testing center was downtown Toronto. So for me, that was a 2-hour trek to get there and to get up to the testing center. So I would leave, take a 2-hour trip, write that thing, be devastated because I hated it, and then take another 2-hour trip home. So it's really just kind of looking at your timelines and figuring out what's going to work best for you.
Yeah, I'll just start by saying I don't know what Elisa and Emma were talking about. No other grad student procrastinates besides them. So don't listen to them. But yeah, no. So I probably procrastinate.
Brady, I think we just have to, yeah, I'm like, I think we have to clarify if that was a joke or not, because
Yes.
I'm like,
Yes,
I see
it was a
everyone
joke.
being undecided. I'm like, no, he's joking. Everyone's procrastinating.
We are all terrible.
Procrastinate, but try to plan for your procrastination, if you will. So I don't remember the exact timeline of everything that I did, but I did. I didn't take like a year off between undergrad, so I studied. I think this is how it went. In my summer between third year and fourth year, I started studying for the GRE, and then wrote it in late summer, early fall of like my 4A term to apply for schools with those GRE scores as of the deadlines were around December of that same year to get in for the following September, if that makes sense. So there was no gap time. I just had the one summer between undergrad and grad school. So if you want to do that, if you want to go right from undergrad to grad school, you need to start doing the GRE and like they're studying for it probably in the summer to write it in the fall to have scores back for the winter to apply. And you also want to give yourself maybe a month of buffer to write it twice if your GRE scores come back poor, because I think they take like a couple weeks or something like that to come back. So granted, I only did the GRE general. I didn't do the specific psych one because the schools I was applying to only required the general. So you can look that up. Usually on the school requirements, they'll say if you need to do the psych specific one as well. That's something to know. Some schools don't need the GRE, so that's another thing to keep in mind. And some deadlines differ. I remember applying to some schools and then being like, oh, I should go look at UBC, and the deadline was the day before. So you should look at, they're definitely not standardized. So get your ducks in a row early, if not just for like an abstract sense of when to be starting to look at things. Earlier never really hurts, especially when it comes to studying for the GRE, especially if you are busy and doing it while you're still in undergrad with courses and things like that. So yes, to come full circle, you can procrastinate, just make sure you kind of plan for it and like that you know how your life is going in terms of how busy you are right now and so on.
Thank you. That really helps. And I know, Emma, you mentioned setting some time aside for cold emailing supervisors. And so that leads into our next question, which is, how did you first contact or learn of your current supervisor? And how did you build that relationship? Like, how did you know that they were the right fit for you?
Yeah, I have to echo what Emma said. Like, I absolutely despise that process of it. It is a very uncomfortable because it's just super weird, like to email somebody, but it's just part of the process. So when I was applying, okay, so I guess to answer the later part of your question first, like how did I find out about these people? Really, like I just turned to Google and looked at faculty in the clinical department at schools that I was interested in. So obviously, depending on like what your goals are, like for clinical at least, like you need a master's and PhD, and obviously Emma, Brady, and myself are pursuing like that route of doing master's and PhD. And so I was looking for somebody who at a school that I could see myself at. Like I knew personally for me, I didn't want to go all the way to like BC to be in school for 6 to 7 years. So I was looking at like schools that I wanted, so that were reasonable. And then I looked at the clinical faculty there. And at first I cast my net really broadly and said like, okay, like who's doing research that I could see myself doing? I think I have another question coming up a little bit later about just like all of that, like that whole process of it. But yeah, so anyway, so I just cast my net broadly to determine like who was doing research that I could see myself doing. And then as I started like accruing that list, I had a really, really long list, and I started narrowing it down like accordingly. And so everyone values different things when they're going to grad school. But for me, like I was like, I just want to do research that I really enjoy because you for a really long time. And so some people cast their net really wide and applied to like 13 schools. I didn't. But once I had that list down of people who I'm like, yep, if I got accepted to this school and this was the only school I got, then I'd be happy with it. Then I cold emailed those professors. So just like Emma said, like I emailed saying like, hey, my name's Elise. This is a little bit about me. I'm applying your program. I attached my unofficial transcript and CV to that. Some people also attach their statement if that's ready. I was too unorganized for that. My statement was not ready. They were lucky they got a CV. But and I just said I was interested. Don't expect a reply from the professors. They're really busy. And so I think I heard from like half of them, and then usually it was a very generic reply of saying like, okay, thanks, I look forward to reviewing it. But I did get like 1 or 2 replies that were really nice and personal. It didn't really make a difference in terms of outcomes, which I got. And I also hear some people get the bonus opportunity of meeting with the professor before that. I didn't request that. I didn't want to seem really presumptuous. You do you. But yeah, most profs have the rule that they won't chat with you until the department can at least look at your application. So it's an even playing field. Yeah, that was my experience.
Yeah, so as a social anxiety researcher, I always joke that our entire lab is about a bunch of socially anxious kids that grew up to be mostly functioning adults. So the idea of me contacting supervisors was probably the worst part of this entire process for me, because still do have very bad imposter syndrome. And so my idea was like, how dare I apply to grad school? Like, no one's going to let me in. And so I had a really hard time. And I look back at some of those emails and I'm like, God, you did not sell yourself at all. Like, come on. And so basically I did the same thing as Elise, where I was like, hi, I'm applying to grad school. I'm really interested in your research. Same deal. I had a CV ready, nothing else. Like I was like, I've done this. I will say probably about 90% of people sent me that wrote, thanks for letting me know. If you get through the first round, I will get back to you. I had a couple say like, oh, I'm really interested in just like learning about you. But again, I can't, like, they don't want to make a promise because the department might throw you out in the first round just because of the number of applicants. So you might have a really great connection with the supervisor, but the supervisor can't always fight for you until the department has gone through. So in terms of meeting my supervisor, she was one of the ones that basically said like, thank you for sending me the application. If you get through the department round, I would be more than happy to talk to you. And then in stories of, you can screw up and still be successful, I applied to the wrong program at U Waterloo. So developmental psych has an MASC program and a PhD program. And I couldn't figure it out, and I got some bad advice, and I applied to the MASC. And so when Heather contacted me, oh God, I want to say about a week before the deadline to accept, and she went, well, I can offer you an MASC. And I'm like, I've already got an offer for a PhD. I don't want to waste your time. And she said, well, I'll offer you a PhD, but I just want to make sure that you are like legit. And I was like, okay. So we ended up having like a 2-hour phone call. And then I did not meet her until she saw me at a conference 2 months later. So Brady, your turn.
Okay. Yeah, we all had different experiences. I guess I want to preface my answer by saying to take it with a large grain of salt, because it was very weird the way I kind of did it. So there were kind of 2 different ways I went about it. And the first way, which is like the more normal way, which is what Elise and Emma did, was I emailed supervisors and I chatted with them and I said, I really liked your research on this paper, and I just like found something I Googled. The other way I did it, and to answer the question on the screen, is I actually met my supervisor technically in second year of my undergrad. So I started working in Dr. Myra Fernandez's lab as an RA in second year. And basically I just I didn't think I knew I was doing this at the time, but I just tried to go to as many optional things as possible and make a good impression. And my goal, I think, at that time was to impress her enough to get an honors thesis with her, because for some reason I thought at the time like getting an honors thesis was like harder than getting into grad school, so I was like gunning for that. And so I got my honors thesis, and then my honors thesis reader, or like the person I had to do the 499B with, was Colin McLeod, who ended up being my other co-supervisor, because I guess impressed him during the 499B talk, and then he liked my final paper, and I said, well, hey, I'd really like to stay here for grad school, and you two both know that I'm kind of a known commodity, so what do you think? And I was in the midst of applying to other schools, like Western and so on, when they called me into their office and said, if we give you an offer, like, will you take it? Because we need to know like right now for some reason. So mine was like a weird 3-year-long grooming process, which is not typical. So to listen to Emma and Elise more than me on this point.
And just to throw like a wrench in it, I do know some supervisors who do not like to take their honors thesis student because they think that like they should go out there in the world and gain more experience, but also having new students with other backgrounds add diversity to the lab. So just to keep that into it as well, that was the conversation I had with my honors thesis supervisor. She's actually a clinical professor, but she was kind of like, I think it would be better for you to gain more experiences out there. And so just to keep that in mind, that if your experience isn't that way, that's okay too.
Yeah. And just to add to that, actually, when I first brought up the idea of going to grad school here with Myra Fernandez, she said that exact thing. She said it's kind of frowned upon to do your grad school at the same school as your undergrad, because you don't get as like the same breadth of experience and just the ways that different labs do things. And then it came later that Colin McLeod got interested, and I was like, oh, well, that's kind of an excuse of getting some variability. At least that would be in another lab. And I said, Myra, I promise if you take me on, I will collaborate with people outside of Waterloo, and I will get this kind of breadth of experience that you think I might lack by going to the same school. But it's definitely atypical. So I agree with what Elise was saying. You shouldn't expect to do grad school with your honors thesis supervisor.
Yeah, and one thing about that is that there are actually some schools that they release their like point systems of like how they like let people into grad school. And I know Dalhousie literally gave bonus points if you were coming from outside of Dalhousie. So you would get like 1 bonus point for being outside of Dal, and then you would get like no points for being within Dal. So that's another thing. Like I think there's like, I don't know if there is like a sort of underwritten culture of like you really should try to branch out, but if you have an amazing
Ottawa was like that too.
Yeah, but if you have a supportive supervisor and an amazing relationship, like that shouldn't stop you. Like, go for it.
Yeah, like the reason why I chose Waterloo, I think, and it was my first choice, was because for the same reason I came here for my undergrad for psychology. So when I was Googling it, they seemed like one of the best psych departments in Canada. And so when it came to pick a grad school, I was like, well, am I going to leave one of the best psych departments in Canada for the reason that it's frowned upon to stay? So you could say like, oh, well, you could have gone to one of the other really good ones, like, you know, U of T or UBC are great psych schools as well. McGill is also great. But for various other reasons, and the fact that they kind of snatched me up rather quickly, I didn't apply to those schools.
Yeah, that's just a very valuable like breadth of experiences across the 3 of you that I think all undergraduate students would consider. And so our next question is kind of heavy for our undergrads, including me, because I have no idea about my career goals. And I'm wondering if you have any idea about your career goals.
I too have no idea. No, well, actually, I'm not kidding. I actually am still debating. And so I always joke that the nice thing with clinical psychology is it's like for the indecisive. It's like I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a full-time clinician and not do research, which if you ever speak to clinical grad students, I would say that there's like a large group of people in clinical who just like hate research, who never want to do it. Or I'm not sure if I want to end up doing research full time. But I think right now, if you're asking me what I hope to do, like having some kind of job that would let me balance both. So being able to work as like a faculty member, but also work, whether that's like in like a hospital atmosphere where I'm doing research as well as clinical work, or working like, in private practice, but collaborating on research projects. Like I think there's options there with clinical, but I definitely see myself balancing both, like the research hat and the clinician hat eventually. But yeah, the specific career goal is still something to be determined. Emma, you just mute. Yeah, there you go.
I should have a better answer for this, seeing as this is my last year of my PhD. I guess this is going to come up again in another question in about a minute, is that typically for research specialists, where I'm not going to be a clinician, my path is basically to stick with research and or teaching. Our typical way out is either we stay in academia, where you either become on the tenure track, where you will be teaching and doing research, or you become a lecturer, which is much more rare, and all you do is teach, or we leave academia and we go work for industry, which in my case, since I do child research, I have a lot of avenues. I could do school board, I could do hospital work, I could do nonprofit work, anything where they're like, we want experience of working with kids and collecting data and knowing like what kids care about. There's a lot of avenues out. The other way is to do something called a postdoc, which is basically like 1 to 3 years of going to work in another lab and gaining different experience. And it's kind of like a middle point between being a student and being a principal investigator or a supervisor. So you have a little bit more freedom, but you're still under the supervision of someone else. So it has its pluses and minuses. But up until about this year, a lot of what Canadian students would do is that we would go to the States for our postdocs, because we know there's a lot of opportunities there. They have different funding sources, they have different methodologies, they have different populations. And so for a lot of us would be going out of country or overseas. COVID has currently stomped on that pretty hard. And so did the US political situation for quite a few of us. And so I'm not quite sure at this point. So what I'm doing right now is that I love teaching. I'm teaching Psych 211 this semester, if anybody is from that. I don't know. So I love teaching. I love doing my research. I would love to stay in a career where I get to do both. But at this point, I'm looking at applying to postdocs and applying to faculty positions because I don't want to leave academia yet.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of aligned with Emma in the sense that I really like research. I would say I like teaching, but I love research. So I'm more on the research side of things. So I'd probably end up going for a postdoc after the PhD. Like Emma was saying, probably somewhere in the States if that opens up within the next 3 years. And then into academia. So right back into the academy as a supervisor, as a prof, something like that. They, much like in undergrad, when they tell you, oh, hey, nobody gets into grad school, so make sure you plan other options. In grad school, they tell you not many people get postdocs and into academia, so make sure you think of industry options when you're done your PhD. And once again, for better or for worse, I'm kind of putting all my eggs in one basket again, and I'm shooting for academia still. But there are other good industry options. Like we've had people from the lab I'm in recently leave and go work for the virtual reality lab at Facebook or something like that. Like there's really cool opportunities out there that you wouldn't think of. But personally, I'm shooting for academia.
Thank you for those responses and gave us like a wide variety of like future career goals. So the next question was basically like a mix of questions that came from students. So students were concerned about graduate student programs being very competitive. So they were wondering like, do you have a recommendation for the number of programs that you should apply to? And then I guess you've touched on this in your answers, but what made you choose Waterloo specifically over other schools?
Yeah. So this, I want to preface by saying, like, is 100%, like, I'm not going to give my opinion because obviously, like, everyone's experience is different. I could just speak about like what worked for me and what I did. So when I applied to grad school, as I mentioned earlier, I was super picky about like wanting to enjoy my life for the next 6 years. And I would say like people have different opinions. I can't speak for like Emma and Brady's experience, but at least with clinical, like I've heard some people have the perspective of being like, I don't really want research. Like I just want to get into a clinical program, get it done and be a psychologist, a clinical psychologist. But for me, I really loved research. And so I only applied to schools that like, I knew 100% I would go to if that was the only school I got. And I would be ecstatic if I got that. Or and B, had supervisors that did the research that I was passionate about and I could see myself working with. And so that really, when we take into account both those factors, it really limited the number of just possibilities. And so when I was applying, I had friends who were applying to 13, 14, 15 schools. I applied to 4. And those were the main factors that I prioritized in terms of like what I was looking for. And then I think you asked why I chose Waterloo. That's on the screen. Okay. Well, I'm biased. I think Waterloo is the best school, and I still stand by that. Our school is absolutely amazing. So I, again, like loved research, and Waterloo is one of the top for producing research, but also the culture at Waterloo from all the schools I interviewed with just really spoke to me. And if you speak to other graduates in the program, all of us say the exact same thing. So Waterloo is a very like, when I was applying to grad school, there were different environments. So some schools were really like competitive and you could really get that sense when you were talking to other students. Some schools really only prioritize clinical work and research was just kind of like a side project. Some schools for clinical work, like it was just the supervision wasn't good. And so for me, like Waterloo was the perfect answer. It was my top supervision choice. And then clinical work, like we also have the unique feature that we're lifespan development. So you actually get trained in children and adults until you decide what you want. Which is really unique. And you get, so we are also like hour to hour supervision. So for every hour I see a client, I have an hour of supervision. But then speaking of research wise and culture, like our culture is the best. The students are awesome. I'm not sure if Brady and Emma have different experiences, but everyone in our department is just like the most collaborative and wanting to help each other. And so, yeah, it's a culture that I didn't experience at any other school. And I have been thankful for my decision to be at Waterloo literally every single day since I decided. So they should hire me as a spokesperson, but I promise I'm not sponsored.
Yeah, so I'm one of those people that was at the opposite end of Elise, where I had the sort of benefit in that at the time of applications, I was single, I didn't have any family, still the situation, which is why I'm applying everywhere for grad school. Or for postdocing, but I basically joked that like I had one cat at the time, and as long as I could put the cat in my backpack and travel, I would go. For me, the big considerations were, did I like the research? Because if I was dedicated, I'd had enough experience in labs to be like, I really, for lack of a better term, I'm like, I don't care, which that doesn't mean the research wasn't valid or wasn't important, but it just didn't motivate me to keep working on it. So I first started by looking for what supervisors were open to taking students, and I looked at their research. And so my thing was doing sort of personality, mental health research and staying in the child adolescent bracket. And so I looked at that. I actually had a spreadsheet, and if anybody ever wants that spreadsheet, it had like 20 columns. But so then there was things like, you know, what type of degree was it? What do I need to apply? And some people will tell you to not bother about funding, that if you really care, funding doesn't matter. I'm going to straight up say that is freaking nonsense, that funding does matter. So if you're looking at schools and they say like, oh, you know, we're going to give you this amount, but only for this long, consider it, because I know some people say like, you know what, your supervisor will pay you out. Not all supervisors will do that. That's really dependent on how much money the supervisor has. Or they say like, well, if you really care about research, if you're a real academic, your funding situation or your income situation shouldn't really be the most important thing. And I'm going to say straight up that if you're stressed about whether or not you're going to be able to eat that week, or if that you're stressed about your loans or anything like that, it's going to come out in your work. So I looked for programs where I was actually going to be able to survive. And then when I was hitting the end of my thing, I had 2 offers. I had Waterloo and I had one to McMaster. And I basically chose it based on the relationship with the supervisor. So Heather and I really clicked. And the research also made more sense in retrospect now that I'm looking back 5 years later. But at the end, the final draw was basically the connection I had with Heather.
Yeah, so I guess I applied to 3 schools technically, but not really. So I applied to Western, and it was like early, and it was just like, yeah, like I'll get back to you if it passes the round. I think I was in the midst of applying to Queens, and then I was in the midst of about to submit to Waterloo when Myra and Colin said, you know, if we offer you this, if you apply and we offer you it, will you stay? And it's kind of just like an impersonal, not impersonal, that's not the right word. A very like casual offer, I suppose. So again, not the typical experience, but I chose to go here and didn't wait to hear back from the other schools because of what I was kind of saying earlier in terms of Waterloo having a really good logistical setup in terms of the amount of participants you can get, the research output you can have. But I think Elisa and Emma really touch on critical aspects of collaboration, super important. I've heard from students at, for example, like U of T, like people hoard resources, they hoard participants, they hoard, technical equipment, things like that. You don't want that. You want to be able to collaborate with other labs and other grad students, and you really get that here at Waterloo. And we have access to cool equipment like EEG and fMRI over at Grand River Hospital, things like that, which is important if you're going into cognitive neuroscience. You want access to the tools that you need as well. And then just to touch on what Emma was saying about funding, I guess that's something we haven't really talked about, and I don't really see it coming up in the questions. But funding is important both at the internal and external level. So internal funding being, what does the school offer you just as like a minimum funding amount for you to live as a master's student or a PhD student, and then external funding is scholarships you can get on top of that. And the 2 big ones you guys should probably be applying for, and Elisa and Emma, correct me if I'm wrong, but the 2 big ones are OGS, which is the Ontario Graduate Scholarship, and CGSM, which is the Tri-Council Master's level funding. So it's basically you submit a research proposal and it's more money. And I believe OGS is school specific. So you apply for OGS at multiple different schools, and some you may get funding and some you may not. And you can use that to make your decision. So if you get into Waterloo and Western, but you get OGS funding at Waterloo and you want more money and scholarship to your name, then maybe you choose Waterloo. Whereas I think CGSM, the Tri-Council one, is portable. So you can take that to any school, I think. So those are things to consider too, is where you get external scholarships versus not, and what the base level internal funding is as well.
Thank you for bringing up that point. Like, especially like funding is something that's an important consideration for undergrad students. But I think we're going to move on to our last question in the interest of time, which is, what is the biggest change from undergrad to grad school, and how is your work-life balance, and do you have any free time?
Oh gosh. Yeah. So it is a really big change. It's a lot of work, but it's a lot of different work, and a lot of adjustments to like just your overall view of things. And so I would say that like in undergrad, I can only speak for myself, but it's very like achievement oriented. Like you're doing classwork for the purpose of grades and like getting certain grades, and like that's how you know if you're doing well or not. Grad school is not like that. I don't know if you heard it before, but grades don't really matter in grad school. You're not learning to get a 90, you're learning to learn, and the amount of work you put in is like to learn and not to get a certain grade, because the reality is like everyone does really well unless something goes horrible. But most people do really well in courses. And so I feel like the biggest change is like also this new level of autonomy that you have. So like you don't have somebody on you with like all these independent deadlines of saying like, oh, you have a quiz this week, an assignment this week. It's a lot more of like being like independently driven and saying, okay, like these are the deadlines I have to meet or research goals I have to meet. And in terms of work-life balance, I think like you'll hear variability from people and how they structure it. And I've heard so many unique ways. And honestly, I'm still learning how to balance like my work and my personal life. And I hear that's something that you continue to learn throughout the program and years. But for me, like I set pretty firm boundaries of saying I try to take time off on weekends, not always possible depending on like what's going on, but trying to take time off on weekends and making sure that I'm still doing stuff for like my mental health and my self-care is really important. And I think that's like really up to you as a student, but it's also similar in undergrad. Like there will be times where it feels like I have absolutely no work-life balance because I'm just like it's scholarship applications and just like I have papers going on. It's just like I'm working more hours than I thought were even possible. But then there's other times where things are a little bit lighter. So it ebbs and flows, but I think like you just prioritize taking time out. And really helpful advice that I got to me is like there will always be stuff to do and there will always be things that you could do to keep yourself busy. So things will never just like be at the standstill until you're done. But you just have to kind of carve away that time to like create space for your mental well-being.
So I'm going to be straight out honest and say I have a garbage work-life balance. And one second, I think another grad student is literally just lurking outside my door. So let me just yell at her. So Brady, you can take this turn and then I will be right back.
Sure, sounds good. Okay, so I think the biggest change from undergrad to grad school, I was going to say that you need to be kind of self-motivated and organized, but I feel like you really need that in undergrad too, with all the different deadlines and things like that. So maybe the biggest change is like, I think it's just kind of I don't want to say the autonomy either. It's weird. It's hard to describe, but like you get your own office and you do your research and you can, in most situations, kind of pick what you want to research and then you go program and you go collect the data and you analyze it and you just check in with your supervisor when you have issues or like in a weekly lab meeting, something like that. So you're treated more as like a colleague of profs than as a student. So that really changes the whole vibe and the whole work setup in terms of like you really feel like you work like it's a job almost. In terms of work-life balance, I guess much like Elise, I try to have a pretty good work-life balance, for better for worse. So I usually try to shoot for 9 to 5 hours. I usually take weekends off, but it really does ebb and flow. Who's that in the back, Emma?
Yeah, so welcome to the social department.
Are they gonna come to the panel?
They're currently entertaining my cat. This is my social bubble, guys. Don't worry about COVID. Yeah, they're wearing masks. They're great. So I'm just gonna, I guess, jump off of what Brady said and kind of finish up my explanation. My situation's a bit weird in that I'm a child researcher. So when I was working in past and doing in-person research, my research basically shifted around the way that kids are available. So I worked a lot of evenings, I did weekends, and so that meant I kept very, very weird hours. So my job has never been a 9 to 5 in grad school. But that same idea of autonomy is that basically my very first week of grad school, Heather said, I'm not going to stand over you and give you a schedule. It's up to you. Because she's like, you know what? Like, you can work from home every day. And I was like, please, God, don't make me do that. And then COVID happened. But what that meant was she was like, as long as you're usually in pass, it means that I have more access to come talk to you and like answer any questions or anything like that. I've had very few, I didn't take a lot of classes because clinical, you take a lot more classes, whereas in developmental, I think I take like 6. So my schedule was really my own, and I struggled really badly in my first year of finding that schedule. So I would be there from like 8 in the morning till 10 o'clock at night because I was like, this is what I have to do in order to be a successful grad student. Not true, very fake. But now I try to at least give myself weekends. It's harder when I have COVID because I'm also an instructor, and so I sometimes have 340 students in 13 different time zones. And so that means sometimes I have students that are sending me like SOS emails at like 11 o'clock at night. And I'm like, yeah, okay, I guess I got to email that because I don't want them freaking out. So grad school is up to you. My supervisor's given me a lot of free will, but it's for better or for worse. It is literally me in that comic. I spend a lot of time sitting there going, I should be writing a paper. I'm going to watch more murder TV instead. And so that's my fault. But
yeah, just to expand, I guess, on what I was saying before, the work-life balance, I think, like what Elise was saying, it falls around scholarship season usually, which is in October through December, depending on what scholarship you're applying for. However, once you get a long-term multi-year scholarship, you suddenly are a lot more free in the fall semester. But definitely until you get that scholarship, like the NSERC scholarship or the OGS scholarship, you are most busy around September, October, November, December, because you are trying to push out research to get publications, which are basically one of the biggest metrics on how they grant scholarships. So it's all about publications in grad school, it seems, at least outside of clinical. There was something Emma said that I wanted to say, but I forget now, so never mind.
All right. I know I said that was our last question, but I just think that this one was super popular, so I'm still going to ask y'all what is one piece of advice you would give undergraduate students who just are debating whether grad school is the right choice for them?
I think, like, if I could go back and tell myself anything, it's like it's a really tough decision, and it is okay not to have all of the answers. And oftentimes I think it feels like everyone knows what they're doing. At least for me, it felt like everyone had a plan and everyone knew what they want, and I really wasn't sure. And I think that's a totally normal thing to have, is like be at this place and be like, yeah, I really don't know. So I think my best piece of advice, if you're not sure, is just talk to people, like talk to grad students, talk to faculty members, like get your toes wet doing research and like being an RA and seeing if like that's actually what you want. Because I think like people's view of like what research is very different than what research is, but also there's so much variability. And I know sometimes when you're doing someone else's research as an RA, it doesn't feel as fun as doing your own work. I know I love doing my own research way more than I like helping somebody else. So I think it's just like trying to like really just be a sponge, take in like everything everyone has to say, and just like try doing lots of experiences. So even if that means right after undergrad, not knowing if that's what you want to do, like taking the time to just get as many experiences as you can to make that decision, because it is a very long time. And I would encourage people to just like think about if that's what you want prior to just jumping in. And I think that level of thoughtfulness also reflects on applications, because the people who are starting grad school are usually people who are pretty confident in like that's something that they're pretty interested in.
yeah, so I have a couple of pieces of advice. The first is that you're never going to feel that you're good enough. At least, like, no matter what you do, there's always going to be that voice in the back of your head that says, I'm not keeping pace. I'm not doing the same as everyone else. I'm just not smart enough. I'm not good enough. I don't know enough. And that voice is always going to be in the back of your head. And it can be the worst voice ever. But you're just going to have to, at some point, you're going to have to step back and be like, you know what? I got in. I didn't fake my way in. They took me. I'm smart enough for this. I know what I'm doing. And it is hard to get to that point. I honestly almost didn't go to grad school because I didn't think I deserved to be here. So I had a very heavy thought in the back of my head of being, I'm not good enough. And so one thing is to try to at least keep that voice on like the down low track in your brain as opposed to the loudest track on your brain. And the other thing is that it's going to be, especially if you go into a research degree, I can't speak for clinical, you're going to have to get used to that idea of uncertainty. Nothing is guaranteed. Your studies won't work out. Your participants won't show up. Your paper won't get accepted. You won't get funding. And you're going to feel like, I'm like what? Like where is the A to B point in grad school? There's no straight line. There's no, it's not like being in the workplace where it's like you get a promotion after 2 years. You're spending 5 years being a learner still while still trying to be successful. And for some people, that's really hard because it's so much easier when you can be able to tick off goals. In grad school, you don't necessarily get that. But if you really just like learning and researching and asking questions and being able to collaborate and just, you like that sort of environment, that uncertainty can be really fun, because sometimes my experiment doesn't work out and I literally just have to go, all right, let's run it again. Let's do it something new. And being able to adapt is really beneficial.
Yeah, I guess a piece of advice for undergrads considering if grad school is right for them, I would take like a really die-hard practical approach in terms of like, you need to know if you really feel like spending the next 5 to 6 years of your life in grad school making less money than almost all of your friends and peers. And if you are okay
below the poverty line.
Yes, below the poverty
like
line.
strategically below the poverty line. Like they do it out of strategy.
Yes, that's how they keep you down for sure. And so there's like that to consider. And also, I know there's a lot of talk amongst grad students, especially if like, you know, should you have kids in grad school? Should you have a family in grad school? Should you settle down? But what if I go to a postdoc in the States 2 years from now? So it's like, it's really hard to start real life for 5 to 6 years while you're in grad school. And some of you might care and some of you might not. And so that's a personal preference that you need to kind of figure out ahead of time, because it's hard to do a lot of real life stuff in grad school. At the same time, you need to figure out if grad school is even appropriate for your career goal. So I actually started and did this whole process backwards by saying, I want to research psychology. Oh, that means I need to be a prof. Oh, that means I need to go to grad school, which means I need to do an honors thesis, and so on and so on. So I worked backwards. So I started from this like idea that thankfully I've somehow stuck with in my head that, yeah, I do like research and I feel okay with it still, but that a lot of people won't stay on that trajectory, and they don't know what they want for the end trajectory. So it's hard to say, but if you have an idea what that end trajectory is, literally just go Google and see if grad school is even appropriate for it. Because a lot of times grad school will make you overqualified for something or is not necessary, and you're just wasting 5, 6 years of your life. So don't do it for the letters in your name. Only do it if it makes sense for your actual career aspirations. And also, if you can, do an honors thesis or be involved in a lab in some way, and you can see if, hey, this honors thesis thing is pretty cool. I want to do this exact same thing day in and day out for the next 5 to 6 years of my life. That would be a pretty good indication if you like grad school. But at the end of the day, it needs to make practical sense, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, and I will say one really nice thing that grad school gave me. So I graduated when I was 22 years old and I went straight into grad school. And it gave me an opportunity to grow up, I want to say. Like it let me feel more in control of my life. It let me take, because I think in undergrad you are told you register, especially in my degree program where I think I was only allowed to choose 3 optional courses. Grad school has allowed me to be a lot more confident in my decisions and has made me turn into someone that is okay being able to turn around and say, like, look, that's not on my plate today. I'm coming back to this later. And so even if you don't, like, I echo Brady's thing, definitely look into whether or not grad school is actually what you need to do. But if you ever feel like, I don't have every single quality that I need to get into grad school, that's what grad school's for. You're going to learn here. That's why they make us do it for 5 years.
Thank you for your responses. I think like the question says one piece of advice, but we have received a lot of information that is going to help us in considering grad school. So now we're going to move on to like the Q&A portion, of the event. And then we already have a few questions in the chat. So there's a few questions surrounding the statement of purpose or the letter of intent. Students are wondering, how do you strike that balance between, like in your letter, between stating personal reasons for applying to grad school versus like research experience? And also just if you had any general tips about writing your statement of intent.
Yeah.
That's a tough question. This is one I wish I wasn't first. I don't know. Okay, well, I guess, so my first, just to touch on like any tips for writing it, like read it and reread it and get your friends and family and other people to reread it if possible. Sometimes things sound great to you and they just sound not great to anybody else. And sometimes it's really hard for you to notice like when things aren't making you sound competitive, but at the same time, it's also really hard sometimes to talk yourself up. I know for me it is. So sometimes like I'd write something and I feel like it could be said to make me like look way better than I made myself be. So having people write it. That's a really tough question about striking the balance between personal reasons. The only thing I can really say to that is like I would encourage you to think about like what they're considering when reading these statements and whether or not adding those personal reasons are going to speak to some of the things that they're looking for in a grad school candidate. So Em already mentioned like ranking of applications. So sometimes schools will like report what I don't know if it's many schools, but sometimes schools will say like what they're looking for in applicants. And so like let's say they're looking for like publications or research experience or like how heavily things are weighted. To mind comes like U Ottawa, I remember when I was applying had that. Some other schools do as well. So I would encourage you to look at those, but also look what the statement's asking for. So I would say like if your statement's like 90% personal experience and you're really not touching on things that are tangible that they're looking for, like I know that's a harsh reality, but like things like publications, research experience, like just grades, academic achievements, then they really won't have much to make a compelling case for bringing you in for an interview. But I would say if you think that your personal experience is going to help them understand where it is you want to go and the reason you're going to be here, like definitely include that. But again, just making sure that you have enough information that's addressing like what it is and showing them that like personal experience aside, like you are a qualified and competitive candidate.
Yeah, so I know for research, I'm not sure about clinical because I've heard either or where clinical sometimes wants a bit more personal than research ever does, because research we're very cut and dry. They're like, you're doing research, you don't have to interact with people, except when you're a developmental researcher, sometimes you definitely have to interact with people. But the way that I've had it recommended to me to be phrased is usually, what do you bring to the table? What do you want to learn? And what does the school offer you for that learning? And so you don't want to write a whole paper about saying, I want to go to a grad school because I'm going to learn this, 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 and this, and this, and this, without talking about what you're bringing to the table. So you want to say, I have already done X, Y, Z. I want to be able to continue into the field of ABC, and this school fits that because they offer A, B, C, D, and F. And so that's what you want to do. You want to say, why you, why them, what you're going to get out of it, because they want to be able to, we're an investment. As brutal and as clinical as that sounds, we are an investment. They're putting money into us, and we're going to carry the school's reputation for the rest of our lives. Like I'm probably gonna be 20 years from now, and someone's gonna be like, oh, you graduated from UW, what was that like? Or they're gonna be like, if I really screw up, they're gonna be like, a researcher graduated from U Waterloo in 20 something and has let down the entire field. They're gonna call me back. And so they want to make sure that they're making a good investment. And so if they can kind of gamble on you because they don't have to train you certain things. So I came in saying, I know how to run participants. I know how to run EEG. I've worked with clinical populations. They were like, okay, we don't have to teach you that. Great. The other thing is I'm going to echo Elisa's thing. Get other people to read your references, or not your references, your statements, because I severely undersell myself. I'm always like, I'm kind of good at things. And like, I think I would be an okay candidate. And like, I would hand it over to my best friend or my mother, and they would be like, you sound, for lack of a better term, like you sound like a loser, and you're not. And so I needed someone outside of me to read it. And so that definitely helps. And as UW students, you guys have access to the Career Center here. They have people specifically trained to help you write these. Like I'm going to them to get them to help me write my postdoc applications. They have people on staff that know what these should look like, and they can tell you what to do.
Yeah, in terms of the letter of intent, the only thing I've heard not to do is to not make it like a sob story if you're going into clinical. So don't be like, I want to research depression because I have depression. This is my experience with it. And it's not even like, I'm not saying having depression is a sob story. I'm saying you can walk a fine line between having personal experience with something or personal interest in something and working that into a pro. So like it might be different from that depression example to say, my late grandfather had Alzheimer's, so I've always been really interested in researching Alzheimer's. But don't do it as like at least I've heard this, don't do it as like a personal, like, I need to solve Alzheimer's disease in the next 5 years to save my grandfather or something, like don't do that. But like Emma was saying, they are really investing in you, and supervisors are busy. They don't want to teach you how to do the basics. So if you can walk in saying, I know how to do data analysis, run participants, and program my own studies, then they know that for the first, like, at least 2 years, like, you're very minimal work. And something that I heard when I started grad school was the phrase, grad students are the lifeblood of academia. And I've thought about that often, and I've thought about how true it is, because the profs themselves often don't run their own research. It's grad student led. Grad students go think of the idea, run the study, do the data analysis, and then write it up with the researcher. So that's kind of where the mutual respect and colleague sense comes from, versus when you're an undergrad. And so they want to like you as a person, but they also want to know that you're competent and can schedule yourself, and not, because they don't want to spend all day running after you when they're trying to teach classes and apply for grants and things like that.
Yeah. I'm going to jump on that real quick, in that I forgot about the personal bit. I always tell my students that I feel like so many people come into psychology because we start with that statement of, I want to help people. And I remember being told as an undergrad, like, that's not good enough. And I remember being so mad for like a week that I stomped around. I'm like, how dare they say that's not good enough? And it's not that it's not good enough, but it's too big. You can't solve the world's problems. You can't cure anxiety or depression. And so when I wrote my statement, I started that I went to undergrad because I have family with developmental disabilities, with various mental health issues. And I started my undergrad career looking for a way to give back to the people that had helped my family. And that I had built my career since then to set myself up for that. Did I do that particularly? No. I went into undergrad with that, I want to help people. But when I look back, I could say, well, why did I want to help people? Well, okay, because of this. And then I picked careers, and I picked opportunities based on being able to do that. And so that's a really good story to tell, which is, I did this because of this. And in order to achieve this, I've done this, 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 and this. And that's how you can work that personal story in.
Thank you so much for just your, again, like, varied responses on this one topic. I think our students have like just a lot of information on how to base their statement of intent. Unfortunately, we have gone over time, so we're going to have to cut the questions part short. And I'd just like to thank all of our like panelists for coming out today. You've been so patient. You've taken like time to answer all these questions. And I'm sure you have like helped out a lot of undergraduate students, and also thank you for the audience members that showed up today. But this concludes our panel because we have run over time. Thanks everyone for attending. If you can see in the chat, like, yeah, Emma has also said that she's always available for questions.
Yeah, I'm also always available. I'm also free to, I was gonna say, I'm free to hang around if anybody has any like questions that we didn't get to. I know that the panel's ending, but
I've got 15 minutes.
Yeah.
All right.
I can do 15 minutes too. Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. These are the questions I wish I had been smart enough to ask, because I was so determined that I was not going to ask for help, and that really came back and bit me. So, oh, I just saw the question. It's called the Career Center at UWaterloo. So it's like the career, whatever, just literally search Career Center at UW, and they have stuff for undergrads.
It used to be called CECA. I think their name's changed now, but you can, I think it's done to the Waterloo Works website, like booking an appointment for this stuff. Yeah. So I'm just gonna scroll up in the chat, and like anyone who needs to leave because their meeting time is over, feel free to leave. But because we have 15 minutes more, there was a question that asked, like, would you recommend applying for a PhD right out of undergrad, or I'm presuming taking a little bit of time off?
Totally up to you. I would say that's completely up to you and what your goals are and where you're at. If you feel ready, then like, who's to say wait? If you're like me and didn't feel ready, wait. But that's entirely like based on like how ready you feel after undergrad.
Yeah. I didn't wait. I went right into it. And I think that was for me was because I couldn't picture anything I wanted to do in that year between. So I know for some people, they're like, oh, I want to go get more experience. I want to travel. I'm like, I don't want to wait. So that for me, I might not have been 100% ready, but I was like, there's nothing else I want to do. So that's why I applied straight out.
Yeah, mine was similar. Like, I mean, you can always think of cool other things to do, like go backpacking across Europe or something, but it was more, again, kind of logistics based, where it's like, okay, this is going to take 5 to 6 years, and then I can start making real money and having a real life. So maybe let's get that ball rolling sooner rather than later. And I think the thing that sold me, because growing up, so after high school and after undergrad, both times my mom said, take a year off, go work, even for minimum wage, save up some money. And what I figured out was like, okay, if I go work minimum wage for a year full time, I can make maybe, I think like 25,000, or at least that was the math before. I think they raised the minimum wage. But I was like, okay, so I can make 25,000, or I can go into grad school a year earlier, which means I then come out a year earlier and start that higher level pay job a year earlier and make, 60 plus out of the gate. So for me, that's what kind of sold me, is like, in the long run, I make more money by just getting it over with. And also my life kind of gets to start a little bit sooner.
Yeah. And like, I feel like when I approached it, I was like also very pragmatic. I was like, I know clinical is so tough to get into. And I was like, I really could go either way. So for me, I'm like, okay, I had very minimal experience that would make me competitive at the time. So I'm like, I need to get more experience. But I almost wish I had a friend like Brady that was like calculating. Brady probably would have saved me some money at like the end of my days. I'd be like, oh man, could I make some extra money there?
Yeah, I will say on that pragmatic side, so I always joke that I come from a very long line of conservative white Christian women, and my mom really broke that mold. But when I told my family, especially my mother's side, that I was going to grad school, their first thing is, well, how old are you going to be when you get out? And I went, well, 27, 28. And they're like, but what if you want to get married? And I'm like, yes, I'm going to drop dead at 28. Like the lines will appear on my face, I'm going to wither away. And so I think that's like, get used to those questions, especially, and maybe Brady, you get these questions. I will be very sorry if you do. I get a lot of questions of, but don't you want to be a mom, or don't you want to get married, or like this whole schooling thing, like I went to go visit my family for the first time in 10 years, and they, instead of asking about my education, they went, well, where's your wedding ring? And I went, I have 2 cats and I live alone. So get used to stupid questions, but I think as you go further, I think you just kind of get really used to being like, I love what I do, so get off my case. But this is just, it made me think of that pragmatics and like laughing in the back of my head, because I think I had someone say, well, you should get started earlier because the sooner you finish, the sooner you can be like a real grown up. And I'm like, I have to pay taxes. Like that counts, right?
Yeah, I don't get that question a lot. But no, but most of my like female friends and like colleagues in graduate school talk about that. So I can imagine just how prevalent it is. I remember when I told I remember plain as day, like we were sitting there for dinner and I told my parents that I want to go to grad school. And the first thing my mom said was, do you really want another 5 years of student debt? And so I had to like explain to her how, no, like you get paid and it's more like really like a job than going to school. And I'm not just sitting in lectures for another 5 years. So you need to do your own research, because people outside of academia and grad school really don't know what it is. My grandparents still think I'm going to be a therapist. So you just need to like take your time and be patient and explain it as best you can.
Yeah. Tacked onto that, you're going to find a lot of people from like the business world do not get it. Like I'm always like, whenever I talk to people, so my parents both came out of finance, and I'm always like, oh, like God, like I'm so like, like grad school, sometimes you get frustrated with everyone. Like me and my office mate, like one day she put my mug on the wrong shelf, and I spent the whole day like sitting there like I couldn't find my mug and I couldn't get coffee, and now I'm mad at you. And my mom was like, you can't act that way with coworkers. Like that's not how coworkers work. I'm like, we're not coworkers. Like grad school isn't like the business industry where my supervisor, Heather's not only my boss, she's my mentor, she's my collaborator, she's the person I turn to when I'm like, I got locked out of my apartment, and that's why I'm late for a meeting. And so it's a really, like, that's something also you're gonna have to get used to. There's no promotions, there's no defined hierarchy. Like, you probably shouldn't go like mouth off to the head of the department, but there's no clear-cut lines of boss versus worker.
All right, and then I guess in the same line, we have another question that says, now that you've been in your respective programs for a bit, and Emma, you're almost done, but do you think that there's ways of reaching your career goals without going to grad school? And I know this question is dependent on career goals, but maybe just achieving what you wanted in life without grad school.
Oof.
Yeah, for me, absolutely not. I want to. I'm like, it's the only way. There's no other way. I really want to be a clinical psychologist, and that is very different from being like, like a psychotherapist or like a social worker who does therapy. They all do very important work. They're just very different work. And so for the actual career aspirations I want in terms of my clinical work and the populations I want to work with and what I want to do in that capacity, the only way is to be a PhD. So there is no other way, but also the only way for me to continue doing research to this extent that I love doing it in is with grad school. So there's no other way to do that. But I would say that, like, just echoing what Brady said earlier about really looking if grad school is what you need, asking yourself, like, what is it that you want to do? I talk to a lot of undergraduate students. This is particular for clinical, but a lot of undergrad students who are like, yeah, I really want to be a therapist. I'm like, if you really want to be a therapist, like, you could be a therapist doing lots of routes. Like, you don't necessarily have to go and get a PhD to do therapy. But people like the name, which, let me tell you, when you are a full psychologist, like, most people don't even use their doctor title. So if that's what you're doing this for, I do not call my supervisor my doctor. So I would just keep that in mind. But yeah, doing what Brady said and really saying, like, is this like the means to the end? And like, for me, for what I want to do, like, this was the only way to do it. But if you want any variation, whether that's like, just helping in a lab and you're not interested in doing your own research, or if you're then you could do something like a research associate, or it's like if you just want to do therapy but you're not interested in like the clinical psych type of things like diagnoses and assessment, then you could do another field. So for me, yes. For other people, maybe not necessarily.
Yeah, grad school is really the only option for me to stay in research, especially because I wanted to control what I was researching. I was always the why kid, so I was always like, well, why does that work? Why does that happen? Why does it work this way? And so I wanted to be able to do a career where I was able to keep asking those questions, but at some point I want to be the person to make that decision. And I'm really lucky that I've been given so much free reign as a graduate student that my supervisor's like, yeah, as long as it like kind of makes sense in our lab, you can do it, or that you can justify it. I have to back up my research. I can't be like, hey, can we spend $10,000 on a new system and then be handed $10,000? Like, that's not happening. But if I can say, I think there is some clinical relevance, there's a societal relevance, and that it makes sense for my dissertation, great. And so I like having that control in my life. That makes me really happy, and I don't think I'd be able to achieve that without being in grad school.
Yeah, much like Elisa and Emma said, I think having a PhD is often the gateway to a lot of different careers. So you can do research in industry and even in academia with just a master's or like an undergrad, but you're often not the one in charge. You're often the lab manager or the RA or some equivalent of that. So if you want to answer the questions that you are interested in, you need to, I find academia is the best for that. And because that's what I wanted to do, there was only one pathway to academia. So I guess that's basically it. Like, it happens to, been that way for us. But also we're on this panel, so it's kind of obvious, and take it with a grain of salt and think what you are actually interested in.
Okay, and then I think we're going to take like our final question, which comes from Maria, and she's asking, how do I figure out my research interests? I think this is relevant because a lot of our professors like push us to do like an honors thesis or just get an RA, some sort of like working role in that way. But students just in undergrad don't know their research interests. So what advice do you have?
And that's so fair. And I think part of it's like luck. Like, if you happen to like, for me, like, so actually, like, when I applied for my honors supervisor, I ended up doing a project that was totally unrelated to the work that she did. And I was like, whoa, what the heck? But it ended up being perfect because I fell in love with it. But so I think like knowing your research interest is really tough, and in part it's probably informed by coursework a little bit and the things you've read. And if like there's anything that you've read that you found particularly interesting, I would say roll with it. And so if like, for example, like I knew I like things like broadly in the area of like clinical psych, but I also really love neuroscience. So I thought I was going to do a clinical neuro one, ended up just doing a full clinical honors thesis. But finding, so like I knew I wanted something clinical, but your honors thesis isn't the end all be all. What you do in your honors thesis isn't necessarily what you're going to do in grad school, but just looking at like similarities. And so I had done some research in clinical psych for coursework. I knew I liked learning about like, you know, mental well-being and stuff like that. And so finding a supervisor that did research in that I could, you know, work in her lab as a thesis student, but at the same time, like volunteering in an RA in different labs to get an exposure. So I worked in like a cognitive neuroscience lab where I worked at like magnitude estimation stuff on a computer, but also worked in like a driving simulation lab. So I did lots of things to see what it was I liked. And all those experience, you, even if it's not, the takeaway is not that I love this, they're all learning. So you can learn like, oh, so that first one I learned, like, you know, I really don't love doing research where people do mostly tasks on computers, and there's not like an interactive component that's directly linked to like mental health. And other things I've done with like serial killer stuff, I'm like, you know, I really realize like I don't love doing research with populations that are almost impossible to do like primary, like direct research. Like I can never collect my own data. And so every experience I had really informed what it was I liked. But I would say that first initial step is kind of just like a leap. And it's probably going to be wrong. To be honest, my first one was wrong. You really don't know. But yeah, just trying to get as much of the experience as you can and reading as much as you can and seeing if there's something that you find particularly interesting.
Yeah, so I'm going to try to fit this in under 30 seconds before I have to jump to my next meeting. I basically started with, I want to do kids and I want to do mental health, and that was it. And I got super lucky that I walked into a grad school where my supervisor was like, all right, so the mental health we're doing is social anxiety, and the kid age we're doing is middle childhood. Anything else is up to you. And that's where I went. And so I got lucky that way. So you can be as specific as you want or as broad as you want. My only things is that I like CNS. I don't want to do it for the rest of my life. And I did not want to do infant research because it's just too finicky. And that was my only guidelines. And I didn't want to do geriatrics. So it was lovely talking to all of you. I got to jump off. Feel free to shoot me an email. I'm always down for video calls or emails. See ya.
Thanks, Emma.
See ya. So the question, just to remind me, was how did you pick your interest area?
How do you determine your research interest in undergrad? Like, how did you know?
Okay. I think in undergrad it was mostly from courses. So at least when I went to Waterloo, you can't even enroll into the psych major until like second year. So you take like Psych 101, and it kind of gives you a little teaser on a bunch of psychology stuff. And then you enroll in the major when you actually think you like it, and then you can start really picking more specialized courses. And so I found out really quickly that I really liked the brain behavior relationship, and I liked brain level explanations for things. So cognitive neuroscience was kind of the way to go, but I tried out other things. I mean, you have to in undergrad. I took social courses, developmental courses, and things like that. And every course I took that wasn't cognitive neuroscience kind of just told me, it reaffirmed my belief that I was not as interested in those other things. So try to take a wide array of courses in undergrad, and then if you think you like something, really try to drill down and take a few courses in it and see if you actually do really like that.
And I'm just going to jump in really quickly with a tip, because this didn't come up in anything, but I think this is important, and Brady can also speak to this. I know that this is like also a time of like really like reaching out to grad students and learning more about that. And one word of caution I want to give is every encounter that you have with somebody could matter for something. So I would try to be professional in everything. This is something that I've learned in my experience as also being like a TA and having people ask me questions. And again, Brady, feel free to jump in. But like as somebody like in a lab, like people can talk, and sometimes like I meet a really awesome student, if that student's applying, and let's say like, you know, it comes time for interviews and we're like deciding between people, I have some experience that I could say like, oh yeah, I've met with them before, they're really nice. I have had students who have emailed me telling me that they're interested in research that I do not conduct, or telling me that they're interested in working with my professor with spelling their name wrong. And all of those whether or not I go and tell my professor, my supervisor right away is one thing, but I would say that like, if they were applying for an honors thesis and people have like, my supervisor might ask, I could say like, oh yeah, they actually emailed me and this, and this. And so again, like Brady could feel free to jump in, but I just want to say like, it's really important that like every experience is a professional, even if it's not super formal. I'm not a super formal person, but I will remember if somebody was like really unprofessional about something or something just didn't sit right with me. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, I fully agree. Show up to your meetings on time. Learn email etiquette, which is something I didn't learn until I was an RA and had to email a lot. But you realize that there's this formula where you start with like, hi, Charles or something, and then you end with, best, Brady. Just like this standardized format, and try to be clear and answer every question that, they send you in the email. You don't want to have to email twice about things and things like that. Yeah, I agree with what Elise was saying.
All right. Yep. Thanks for the extra tip. Like I'm like second judging, like second guessing my email.
No need to. You have emailed me. You're fantastic. But I just in terms of just like even going forward, just like no emailing people that you've never met and be like, hey, Brady, I've read your work and I'm interested. Might apply for some people, but you never know how somebody's going to take that. And so just always putting your best foot forward and trying to make sure that like any interaction that you have with someone could lead to something potentially exciting, whether that's an RA position in their lab or, volunteer position. So yeah.
Yeah, and even in your courses, my supervisor says if you are looking for a bright research assistant, look to the brightest students in your courses. Look to the most eager students.
Yes, I have done this.
Yes, and grad students talk, and they talk between areas. So if you are like a known good student in the undergrad community here, like we probably know about you in a creepy way. So, you are, when you're on campus and you're interacting with people that you might need to actually have more professional relationships with later, you should try to be aware of that for sure.
All right, that is extremely valuable advice. In addition to like everything that you've shared in this panel, you've stayed over time, and just thank you so much for staying, and then thank you to our audience members. But yeah, this concludes our panel. I cannot say, I'm just gonna say thank you once more to our panelists. But yeah, I hope everyone has a great day, and I hope you were able to have some of your answers about like questions about grad school answered today. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Shoot me an email if you have any more questions. It's somewhere up in the chat.
Yep, me too.
All right. See you.
Bye.